So let's talk about the next section here, secure network design. So one of the challenges that I think a lot of organizations have not fully realized or fully invested in is around designing their network to be as secure and hardened as possible from the start. Now, what I mean by that is generally things that started out and they don't scale well. So a lot of the network designs, again, companies grew from 100 employees to, 10,000 employees. And again, a lot of this is not predictable, but what I've typically seen again is a lot of networks, they just don't scale well, and this poses problems for you as a security administrator or you as a cyber analyst to have to deal with. And we'll talk about some of these areas with network design that you want to pay attention to. So let's identify methods to harden the network. We're going to talk about segmenting networks and providing secure zones. We'll then proceed on and talk about policies and different access controls as well. And I'll talk about endpoint security systems to help control that network access, right? So one of the, of course, most secure ways to isolate a network is to have an air gap. Basically, don't connect it to the network. And it's a good way to isolate it, right? Again, that's not practical in a lot of cases, but sometimes that could be a way to mitigate possible issues that may come up. So again, just when you're designing your architectures, just be aware that there's many different ways to isolate your network. Not having an interface card. Well, again, if you don't have a network interface card, it's not on the network. But then again, you can't really manage it, and it's just not practical, right? Now, one of the more common ways to approach this is to use what's called segmentation. Now, segmentation is where you create VPNs and VLANs. Now, a VLAN is basically you're taking a physical network and divvying up that physical network into different virtualized networks is basically what you're doing. You could add firewalls. You could virtualize switches. Again, plenty of areas to implement here. Could use ACLs as well. Another way to segment, for example, your network from the internet is to have what's called a DMZ, which is a demilitarized zone. Now, this is typically an internet-facing zone where hosts are not fully trusted. Typically, you're going to have a bastion host, and that's also known as a jump box, actually, where, again, you could allow management from that as well. But again, the goal of having a DMZ, a jump box, is to provide that isolation from the network in most cases. So plenty of capabilities, plenty of scenarios where you can really implement a solid network. Now, another recommendation is to consider also having basically a architecture that is multi-layered as well physically, not just create like a flat network as it would be called. And again, if you do that, you have the ability to segment, not only virtually, but also physically, possibly. Some other terms you want to know for the exam, know what these are. So a black hole is essentially an interface that you're going to basically direct traffic to basically an unreachable segment. a black hole VPN basically has no routes to it and no default gateway. Again, it's a way to get traffic sort of routed out of the way for the time being. It's not certainly a valid long-term solution, but it's typically used, especially if there's a DDoS attack. So, for example, if you do have a DDoS attack, again, what can happen is it could overwhelm your servers, right? And those requests are not going to be met because your server's just bogged down by the DDoS attack, right? So again, if you could route, if you know like where the traffic's coming from, you could route that traffic that's the DDoS attack to basically a black hole, as it's known. Another term is called sinkhole routing. This is another way to filter malicious traffic, basically. And then a honeynet. This is basically where you're publicly advertising a segment, and the hackers say, oh, well, I just found a network segment. Let's go ahead and try to get in. Now, the goal of this is to try to research and study what the hackers are doing, right? Martians. This is a route for private or reserved IPs, and bogans, unallocated or allocated unassigned IP addresses. Interesting names, right? Now, on the exam, again, you're going to be expected to know black hole, sinkhole, and a honeynet, and that's fair game. I didn't see anything testing on Martians or bogans, but I don't know. Maybe I missed that on the test. But anyways, as far as attack surface, that is. If you reduce the attack surface, then you should reduce the risk of attack. So, for example, reduce the number of public-facing interfaces, reduce the number of services. Also, too, don't leave ports open that don't really need to be open. Very common. So harden your host, for example. Create a baseline, right? For example, you could use the MBSA tool from Microsoft. That'll help, of course, as well. When you're thinking about creating a baseline, again, try to identify what kind of a baseline is going to turn on the minimum amount of services, and then make sure disable what doesn't actually need to be on. And again, generally too, when you're creating a VM, you want to create a secure template as well. Have controls in place to mitigate in case there is a failure. So again, a lot of scenarios to look at. When it comes to compensating controls, just the goal is to make sure you have the right procedures in place. For example, I want to make one more note here actually on baseline. So when you're looking at baselining your host, again, you want to not only install the minimum OS components, but also install the required patches. You want to also, too, make sure that you disable like administrator accounts that don't need to be open, and definitely change administrator to, for example, another name so that it's not just blatantly administrator. Again, change the password as well. You don't want to leave administrator and then password, right? That's fairly easy to guess. Have group policy objects. So if you're, again, looking at essentially basically creating templates, let's say, basically for a baseline, you want to create a template. Easiest way to sum it up. You want to create basically security settings, and those objects typically are going to be part of a template, depending on, of course, the software. The software that you may be using may be named a little differently, but at a high level, a template is going to hold the GPOs. So, for example, if you're going to set up Active Directory, have those settings. If you're going to set up a group policy management profile, again, try to determine what is appropriate. What is discretionary access and mandatory access? So again, discretionary. So DAC and MAC, they're basically models is basically what they are. So DAC just basically says that the owner is going to be the original creator of the permissions of the ACLs, and that they should grant whatever access that they want to that resource. Mandatory access control is similar to like role-based access control, where basically you need to have like a specific level of clearance. So basically, if you're familiar with the U.S. government, then you would know they have secret, top secret, confidential, etc. That's considered mandatory access control. You have to, be approved for a certain level of access. Endpoint security. Now, with endpoint security, again, you want to make sure that you not only look at your host, but look at the endpoint. So, for example, any appliances, any mobile connections, right? Make sure that you analyze that as well. Some examples of different endpoint security items you may want to look at. Again, port security, MAC filtering, these are very common terms that I'm sure you're familiar with and we've talked about already briefly. So when it comes to port security, again, one of the things too, when you walk into a data center, you can generally tell the posture of the corporation by whether or not the cabinets are locked, right? Whether the ports are disabled that are actually not cabled. So again, having a port on that is actually not cabled is a not really a bright idea, because someone could connect up to that cable and literally log into your network. So again, you would assume that someone in your data center should be there and wouldn't be a security risk, but again, this happens more than a few times. So again, posture your physical port security appropriately. And then also too, another way you could address that as well is only certain MAC addresses will be authorized to log into the switch. So again, most switch vendors support that. So if you just want certain MAC addresses to log in, great. Or you want specific ports, that's up to you to address. Again, MAC address can make sense as well in a lot of cases. It's more static. The downside of MAC limiting and filtering is that if you do need to add a new device, you got to make sure you configure the zoning or the ACLs appropriately. Port-based network access control. You want to authenticate the user to the device and or the device before enabling the port, of course. So now, when it comes to PNAC or port network access control, just realize that each of the switch vendors, for example, could mean a little differently. But from a generic level, again, you want to have typically a server that is going to authenticate the port in the user. And that's typically done with like a radius server using a radius protocol. So, for example, if it's a guest, they got to log in with the guest VLAN, for example. Again, fairly straightforward security protocols, but again, if you're not a network administrator, this may not make a lot of sense. Now, one more thing to point out too is make sure too that you address in your acceptable use policies and your response policies how you're going to address network access control. Again, if you don't address it, then you shouldn't expect the proper procedures to be followed. So we talked about different ways to harden the network. Remember, the most basic way is to not connect it to the network in the first place. But again, that's not realistic. So you may need to use basically VLANs or VPNs or something of that nature, virtualization essentially. Have policies in place, and then make sure you have endpoint security systems. So here's an exam tip. What type of isolation ensures that the host is physically disconnected from any network? That's called an air gap. And then what type of an attack does MAC limiting mitigate? ARP spoofing and flooding attacks. Again, just be aware of that. All right, let's continue on to the next module.